At 54, I had finally stopped apologizing for the life I'd chosen. Then my son showed up at my cabin door on a Thursday afternoon with his new wife, 2 duffel bags, and a smile that reminded me of someone I used to be married to. Before I could say a single word, she looked past my shoulder into the living room and said, "Oh, this is so much better in person." Theo talks about it constantly. And then, almost as an afterthought, she turned to me and added, "We're going to need the back bedroom. He has calls starting at 6 in the morning and the light in there is better." I smiled. I said, "Of course." And I quietly started doing the one thing neither of them expected. By the next morning, there was a sealed envelope sitting on the kitchen table beside a fresh pot of coffee. When Theo's wife opened it and read what was inside, every single assumption she had carried through my front door the day before collapsed. Before she'd even had her first sip, she had come for my cabin. She left without her sunglasses. Let me tell you how it happened. My name is June Calloway, and I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest. I am not a woman who panics. I spent 26 years as a hospital administrator in Western Pennsylvania, which means I have sat in rooms with terrified people and furious people, and people who were both at the same time. And I have learned to keep my hands very still, and my voice very even, and I have learned that the person who stays calm longest almost always wins. I retired at 52. It wasn't how I'd planned it. My husband, Gerald, died 18 months before I intended to stop working. And afterward the hospital felt like a place I was visiting rather than a place I belonged. So I took my pension, I took the life insurance, and I bought 43 acres of wooded land outside Morgantown, West Virginia, with a 2-bedroom cabin that needed everything done to it. The roof, the plumbing, the floors, as the deck. I did most of it myself. Or I learned how, which is the same thing when you have time and the internet and a reason to keep your hands busy. By the time I'd been there 2 years, it was mine in every sense of the word. My herb garden ran along the south side of the porch. My trail markers were orange and yellow because I liked the way they looked in October. My wood stove, my split logs, my cast iron pan that had belonged to Gerald's mother, and that I had no intention of giving to anyone ever. Small things mine. My son Theos was 31 and had been living in Charlotte. We talked on Sundays when he remembered, which was about twice a month. He was a good person, in the way that some people are good without ever quite being present, warm when you had his attention and genuinely forgettable when you didn't. I had made my peace with that. I loved him, I just didn't expect much from him. And that had kept our relationship functional. He called me on a Wednesday to say he and his wife Kira were going to be passing through, and could they stop in for a couple of days. What I did not know, because he did not tell me, was that they had gotten married 6 weeks earlier in a ceremony I had not been invited to. I found this out when they pulled into my gravel driveway on Thursday afternoon and Kira introduced herself as Kira Calloway with the easy confidence of someone who had been using that name for a while. I shook her hand. She has a firm grip and a direct gaze. And the first thing I thought was, she's done this before. Not the handshake, the entrance. Theo hugged me and said, "You look great, Mom." Which is what people say when they feel guilty and want to move past it quickly. "Come in," I said. "I'll put on coffee." Kira moved through my cabin the way certain people move through a space they are considering purchasing. Not rudely. She didn't open drawers or touch things that weren't hers. She just looked, slowly, appraisingly. Her eyes traveled from the exposed beam ceiling to the Riverstone fireplace, to the back windows that faced the ridge. "The light in here is incredible," she said in the tone of someone making a note. "Thank you," I said. I oriented the windows myself. She smiled. Theo started talking about the drive and whether I had Wi-Fi. We had dinner that evening. I made chicken and roasted vegetables because I had them. And because I cook when I'm processing something. And what I was processing was the feeling that the air in my cabin had changed in some way I couldn't name yet. Kira was charming at the table. She asked questions about the property, the acreage, the well, the septic system, which is a strange set of things to ask your new mother-in-law over dinner, unless you are performing due diligence rather than making conversation. Theo talked about Charlotte. He'd left his marketing job, he mentioned casually, and was exploring some opportunities. Kira, he explained, was the business mind. "What kind of business?" I asked. "Real estate," she said, refilling her own wineglass without being asked, "primarily rural properties." There's a real market for it right now. People want to get out of cities. I know, I said. I'm one of them. She smiled again. It was a good smile. Practiced, but good. Exactly, she said, which is why you understand how valuable what you have here really is. I said nothing. I took a small sip of wine and watched her watch me. After dinner, Theo mentioned the morning calls. He delivered it gently, by his standards. He said Kira had some early client work East Coast time, and they'd need quiet in the back of the house starting around 6. You're up early anyway, right, Mom? You always used to be. I am, I said. And Kira mentioned, she loves your cooking. If there was something simple in the morning, that would honestly be amazing. You don't have to do anything elaborate. Kira waved a hand as if to say it was nothing. The gesture itself implying it was definitely something. Whatever's easy for you, June. Eggs, toast. Theo always says you make the best coffee. I looked at my son. He had the expression of a man who has been coached on how to ask for something and is hoping the coaching holds. Of course, I said. I'll have something ready. Theo visibly relaxed. Kira smiled at the table. Neither of them saw me register what had just happened. I had been in my own home, converted from a mother into a service. I did not sleep much that night. Not because I was upset. I have never wasted much energy when I could use it for useful things. But because I was thinking, Kira's questions at dinner hadn't been curiosity. They were inventory, the well, the septic, the acreage, the road access. She had been building a picture, and the picture she was building was not one that included me living in it. I got up at 5:15 and started the coffee, and while it brewed, I opened my laptop. Kira's maiden name was on the wedding announcement I found after 12 minutes of searching. Theo had posted a photo on his Instagram, captioned simply, "She said yes" from 6 weeks ago with no further detail and 411 likes. Her name was Kira Denholm before the marriage. I started there. The first thing I found was a dissolved LLC in Tennessee. Denholm Property Solutions, registered 2 years ago, closed 14 months ago, sole proprietor. The second thing was a small claims case in Knox County. A couple in their late 60s had filed against Denholm Property Solutions for failing to deliver on a property management agreement. They had signed over management rights to a vacation property in the Smoky Mountains, based on a contract promising quarterly revenue distributions from short-term rentals. The distributions had never arrived. The LLC had dissolved before the case was resolved. I sat with that for a moment. The third thing I found took me 20 minutes and a lot of cross-referencing. But I found it. A woman named Constance Ehrlich, listed in an online community forum for a senior homeowners group in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Her post was from 16 months ago. She had written it the way people write things they've held in for a long time. In a rush, without paragraph breaks, with a few spelling errors that she clearly hadn't gone back to fix. She had owned a mountain cabin for 22 years. She had been approached by a property consultant who told her the rental market was strong and that professional management could generate income for her retirement, while she transitioned to something more manageable. She had signed the management agreement. She had not seen a single check. By the time she realized what had happened, the company was gone. The consultant's name in her post was A.K. Denholm. I wrote Constance a message. Then I called my attorney, a woman named Susan Park, who had handled my property purchase, and who I had kept on retainer because I believe in having a good attorney, the way I believe in having a good doctor. You want them before you need them, not after. I left Susan a voicemail explaining the situation and asking her to look into the Tennessee case. It was 6:08 in the morning. Then I made eggs, scrambled, because they're harder to get wrong when you're thinking about other things as toast, fresh coffee, orange juice. I set the table for two because Theo would be joining her and I was not going to shortchange my son over something that wasn't his fault yet. Kira appeared at 6:45 looking rested and purposeful. "June, this is so sweet of you," she said sitting down. "It's no trouble," I said. Theo came down 2 minutes later. He kissed my cheek, which he hadn't done in years, which told me he was still feeling guilty about the wedding. We ate. Kira kept her phone beside her plate face up, which is the move of someone who expects to be interrupted by something important. She asked me, over toast, whether I had ever thought about the property generating income. "Cabin rentals are doing incredibly well right now," she said. "A place like this, with the acreage, the views, the privacy. You could easily clear 3 to 4,000 a month without even being here. Without being here, I repeated. You could stay with us in Charlotte, Theo offered, and I heard in his voice that this was a line he had been given. We have room. It would be good to have you closer. I was 54 years old. I had built this property with my hands and my grief, and my very specific intention to live alone in the woods and answer to no one. I was being invited to go stay in my son's apartment in Charlotte and let his wife manage my 43 acres for money that would not reach me. That's so thoughtful, I said. I'll think about it. Kira smiled. Theo looked relieved. I excused myself to refill the coffee pot and stood at the kitchen counter for exactly 10 seconds with my back to them. Breathing. They went for a drive that afternoon. I learned later, from Susan, who had done some checking, that they had visited 2 local realtors and asked about comparable property values in the area. While they were gone, I called Constance Ehrlich. She answered on the 3rd ring, and her voice was the voice of a woman who had been waiting to tell her story to someone who might actually understand. We talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Constance was 68, a retired schoolteacher, and she had spent 14 months trying to recover what she estimated was $31,000 in lost rental income from a property she no longer effectively controlled. The LLC dissolution had made the legal route slow and expensive. She had filed a complaint with the Tennessee Consumer Protection Division. She had heard nothing back for 11 months. I asked her if she would be willing to write down what she'd told me. Dates, names, the specific language of the contract, the promises that had been made. She said she already had it written down. She had written it down many times, for many people, and each time she hoped it might be the time it mattered. This time it will, I said, and I meant it. Because I was already thinking about Susan and about the West Virginia Attorney General's office, and about the fact that Kira Denholm had apparently not thought very hard about what happens when you attempt to run the same play on a hospital administrator. I know how to build a case file. I have built hundreds of them. Incident reports, pattern documentation, supporting statements, timeline of events. I spent 23 years organizing information so that decisions could be made clearly. This was not different. By 9 that evening I had a folder, printed and clipped in the order I intended it to be read. The LLC registration and dissolution records. The Knox County small claims filing with the case summary. Constance's written statement, which she had emailed to me in full, 3.5 single-spaced pages. And a formal complaint I had filed online with the West Virginia Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division before dinner, which had generated a confirmation number I printed and placed at the back. On the front of the folder, on a piece of my good stationery, I wrote one line. Before we continue our conversation about this property, I think you should read this. I put the envelope on the kitchen table where the coffee pot would go in the morning. Then I went to bed. My alarm went off at 5. I got up, ground the coffee, sliced the fruit I'd set out the night before. By 6 o'clock the kitchen was warm and everything was ready and the envelope was exactly where I'd left it. Kira came downstairs at 6:15. She moved the way she always moved. Efficiently with intent. She poured herself a coffee, sat down, and then she saw the envelope. She picked it up, read the front, set her coffee cup down with more care than the action required. What is this? She said. Good morning, I said. There's fruit on the counter. She opened the envelope. I watched her the way I used to watch a room when someone was about to receive difficult information. Not staring, just present, attentive, tracking the small things. The way her right hand stilled on the 2nd page. The way her jaw shifted on the 3rd. The way she got very quiet by the time she reached Constance's statement, which was the most specific and the hardest to argue with. Theo came downstairs at 6:40 and read the room before he read anything else. He looked at his wife, then at me, then at the papers on the table. What's going on? Your mother left me some reading material, Kira said. Her voice had changed. The warmth was gone and what was underneath it wasn't anger exactly. It was calculation. The same thing Ryan's face had shown in a different key. I want to make sure we're all working from the same information, I said, before any decisions get made about my property. Theo picked up the papers. I watched him read. He was not a fast reader and he was clearly not prepared for what was there, because his face moved through several things in a short period of time. Confusion, then something like recognition, Then something I can only describe as a man realizing he has been carrying something for someone and has only just noticed the weight. Kira tried, for about 10 minutes. She called the Knox County case a misunderstanding with a client who had unrealistic expectations. She said Constance Ehrlich was a very difficult person who didn't read her contract. She said the LLC had been dissolved for accounting reasons, not legal ones. Each explanation arrived slightly faster than the last, which is what happens when a story hasn't been built to survive examination. Theo said almost nothing. He sat at my kitchen table with the papers in his hands, and he listened to his wife explain things, and I could see the moment he stopped believing her. It was during the Constance explanation, when Kira used the phrase, emotionally unstable older woman, and something shifted very visibly in my son's face, because he was sitting across from his mother, who was also an older woman, and he was doing a particular kind of math. Kira, he said, stop. She stopped. The room was very quiet. I filed a complaint with the state attorney general yesterday evening, I said. It includes Constance's statement, the case documentation from Tennessee, and a summary of the representations that were made to me during dinner last night, and this morning about my property. I paused. The office is aware of the pattern. My filing adds documentation to what they were already tracking. Kira stood up. She was controlled but only barely. This is a massive overreaction, she said. Perhaps, I said. I've been told that before. Usually by people who were hoping I wouldn't act. She went upstairs. We heard her moving. Drawers. A zipper. The sound of someone packing faster than they'd like to. Theo stayed at the table. He didn't look at me for a while and I let him have that, because some things need a moment before they can be said. Did you know? He finally asked. Not about me, about her. I didn't know specifics, I said. I knew something was wrong the moment she asked me about the well system over dinner. He was quiet again. She said the cabin could be a fresh start for us. For our finances, I told myself she just meant. He stopped. I don't know what I told myself. You told yourself what you needed to, I said. That's not the same as knowing. Kira came back downstairs with her bag and the kind of composure that takes effort to maintain. She looked at me with a directness I almost respected. I hope you understand this is going to affect your relationship with your son. I hope you understand, I said pleasantly, that I thought about that before I printed anything. She left without saying goodbye to either of us. We heard her car on the gravel, and then the sound of it on the road, and then nothing. Theo sat at my kitchen table for another 40 minutes. He drank 2 cups of coffee and said very little, and I sat across from him and said equally little, because sometimes the most useful thing you can do for someone is stay in the room while they think. Finally he said, "How long did it take you to find all of that?" "An evening," I said. "And part of the morning." He shook his head slowly. Not at me, at something else. She always said she was working on something big that, it was going to set us up. I kept asking for details and she'd say I'd understand once it came together. The property was going to be the something big, I said. He looked up. Mom, I didn't know what she was planning to do. I know, I said. I knew she'd had deals that had gone sideways before. She said it was bad clients. I believed her. He set down the cup. I think I wanted to believe her. That sentence landed the way honest sentences do. Quietly, without fanfare. I thought about all the years I had believed Gerald's mother when she said things were fine and they weren't. I thought about the way wanting something to be true can look, from the inside, almost indistinguishable from knowing it is. Okay, I said. So what do you do now? He looked at me, and for the first time in years he looked like the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table in Pittsburgh and ask me questions he didn't know how to answer on his own. I don't know, he said. That's a reasonable place to start. He stayed 2 more days, not as a guest with a list of requirements. As my son, who helped me restack the wood on the porch and asked questions about the trail system, and ate whatever I made without commenting on the time I made it. On his last morning, we sat on the deck with coffee and watched the fog move off the ridge, and he told me he was going to talk to a lawyer. About the marriage and about some money Kira had moved through a joint account he hadn't fully understood at the time. Good, I said. I should have called you more, he said, not to tell you about her. Just in general. Yes, I said, you should have. He smiled a little because it was the kind of answer he'd grown up with and had apparently missed. I heard from Susan Park 8 days later. The West Virginia Attorney General's office had made contact. The pattern I had documented, combined with the Tennessee case and Constance Ehrlich's statement, had given investigators enough to formally open a consumer protection inquiry into Kira Denholm's property management activities across 2 states. Constance's original complaint, which had been sitting largely unaddressed for 11 months, had been escalated as part of the inquiry. I called Constance to tell her. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, 11 months. I started to think I'd made the whole thing up. You didn't, I said. No, she said. I just didn't have anyone with the right kind of patience. I thought about that afterward for a while. Patience is probably not the word most people would use for what I did. I had the information by early morning. I had filed the complaint before dinner. What I had wasn't patience, it was timing. I knew that acting too quickly would give Kira the chance to minimize it, call it impulsive, frame me as a hysterical older woman who'd panicked over a conversation about rental income. Waiting until morning, until the coffee was made and the papers were neatly ordered, and she was sitting at my table eating fruit I had cut. That wasn't patience. That was precision. I'm good at precision. I spent 23 years in hospital administration. You learn to pick your moment. The cabin is exactly the same as it was. My herb garden came back full this spring. The orange trail markers held through the winter. Gerald's mother's cast iron pan is on the stove where it belongs, and most mornings I'm up before 6 with coffee in the ridge, and no one asking me to be anything other than what I am. Some people will look at a woman living alone in the woods and see a problem to be solved, a resource with no one guarding it, an opportunity dressed up as a concern for her well-being. They'll show up with smiles and reasonable-sounding questions about your well, and your septic, and your square footage. And they'll sit at your table and eat your food and explain, very gently, that you are perhaps not quite capable of managing what you have. What I want to say, to Constance, and to every woman who has sat across a kitchen table from someone's explaining her own life back to her in terms designed to make her feel small, is this: you are allowed to be very, very quiet while you work. You are allowed to make the coffee and cut the fruit, and smile at exactly the right moments. And then you are allowed to put everything you found in an envelope and leave it somewhere it cannot be ignored. Stay with me here on Selina Payback, because we're just getting started. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, someone who is holding on to something she built, someone who needs to know that living alone does not mean living without protection, send this to her. I'll see you next time.